In January 1066, an English king died without an heir, and in doing so, lit a fire that would engulf an entire kingdom. The throne of England was suddenly up for grabs, and not just anyone wanted it. Three of the most dangerous warlords in Europe were ready to fight for it. In England, there was Harald Godwinson, just crowned king and backed by the English nobility. Across the sea in Normandy was Duke William, ambitious, ruthless, and convinced the crown was rightfully his. And from the frozen north came Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, a giant with a reputation for conquest. One throne, two invaders, and a year of blood and fire that would decide the fate of a nation. This is how the Normans conquered England. It all starts at the deathbed of King Edward the Confessor. He was respected, even admired, but he had one fatal flaw. He had no children. When he died on January 5th, 1066, he left behind a massive power vacuum. And in medieval Europe, a power vacuum never stays empty for long. The question of who should be king wasn't simple. It wasn't just inheritance. It was promises, politics, and raw ambition. The first to act was Harald Godwinson. He was the most powerful man in England, a seasoned commander and part of the country's dominant family. The English council, the Witan, needed stability fast. So they chose him. The day after Edward was buried, Harald was crowned king. But that decision didn't settle anything. It lit the fuse. Across the Channel, Duke William was furious. He claimed Edward had promised him the throne. Even worse, he said Harald himself had sworn an oath to support that claim. To William, this wasn't just politics. It was betrayal. So he began preparing for invasion, raising an army, building a fleet, and waiting for the right moment. But he wasn't alone. In Norway, Harald Hardrada also saw his chance. His claim was shaky at best, but that didn't matter. He was a Viking, and England was rich. That was reason enough. Then things got even messier. Harald's own brother, Tostig, had been exiled and wanted revenge. He joined forces with Hardrada and promised that England would rise against Harald. It wouldn't, but it gave Hardrada the excuse he needed. So now Harald faced two invasion threats, from north and south. All he could do was wait. For months, his army stood on the southern coast, watching for William. It was expensive, exhausting, and unsustainable. Most of his soldiers were farmers. They needed to go home for the harvest. So in early September, Harald made a call that would change everything. He sent them home, and almost immediately, everything went wrong. News arrived from the north. Hardrada had landed. A massive Viking force, thousands strong, had invaded near York. And the northern English army tried to stop them and got crushed. York surrendered. The north was falling. Harald didn't hesitate. He gathered his best troops and marched north, fast, nearly 200 miles in just a few days. It was an incredible push, and it caught the Vikings completely off guard. They were camped at Stamford Bridge, relaxed, some without armor, celebrating their victory. Then Harald's army appeared. The battle was brutal. The Vikings fought hard, but they were unprepared. Both Hardrada and Tostig were killed. It was a total victory. The last great Viking invasion of England was over. But Harald didn't get time to celebrate, because just days later, everything shifted again. The winds in the English Channel finally changed, and William set sail. He landed in the south with around 7,000 men. No resistance, no opposition, just a clear path inland. The Normans had arrived. Harald was still in the north when he heard. His army was exhausted, wounded, but there was no choice. He turned them around and marched south again. In just a few weeks, he had fought a major battle, marched the length of England, and now had to do it all over again to face a fresh enemy. This time, there would be no second chance. Harald reached the south and took position on a ridge near Hastings. It was strong ground, high, defensive. His army formed a shield wall, tight, disciplined, almost unbreakable. When William attacked, it didn't go well. Norman arrows couldn't break the line. Infantry assaults failed. Cavalry charges were pushed back. Again and again the English held. At one point, rumors spread that William had been killed. Panic started to ripple through his army. But William rode forward, lifted his helmet, and showed his face. He was alive, and the fight continued. The battle dragged on for hours. Then something changed. A group of Norman soldiers started to retreat. Some of the English broke formation and chased them. It was a trap. The Normans turned, surrounded them, and cut them down. William saw the opportunity and repeated it, again and again. Each time more English soldiers left the safety of the shield wall, and each time the line got weaker. By late afternoon, the wall was starting to break. Then came the final moment. Norman archers began firing high, raining arrows down from above, and somewhere in that chaos, King Harald was struck. Traditionally said to be in the eye, he fell, and with him the resistance collapsed. The Normans surged forward. The remaining English fought to the death around their king, but it was over. The Battle of Hastings was lost, and with it, Anglo-Saxon England. But even then, it wasn't done. William expected to be crowned immediately. He wasn't. The English named a new king instead, so William changed tactics. He marched around London, burning, destroying, cutting off supplies. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. By Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England, but holding the crown was another matter. Rebellions broke out across the country. William responded brutally. The worst was the harrying of the north, a scorched earth campaign that devastated entire regions. Villages burned, crops destroyed, people starved. Resistance didn't just fail, it was erased. To lock down control, the Normans built castles everywhere. Simple at first, wooden towers on mounds, but incredibly effective. They dominated the landscape and kept the population in check. Then came the power shift. William stripped land from Anglo-Saxon nobles and gave it to his Norman followers. It wasn't gradual, it was total. Within a generation, almost the entire ruling class had been replaced. To keep track of it all, William ordered the Domesday Book, a massive survey of land, wealth and resources across England. Nothing was missed. It gave him complete control over taxation and ownership. But the biggest change wasn't just political, it was cultural. The Normans brought a new system, feudalism, land in exchange for loyalty. A strict hierarchy tied directly to the king. They also brought a new language. The ruling class spoke Norman French. The church used Latin. The people kept speaking English, and over time those languages blended. That's why English today is full of French words, especially in law, government and food. Peasants raised cows, lords ate beef. It's a small detail, but it tells the whole story. Over generations, the divide faded. Normans and English intermarried. Cultures merged, and eventually something new emerged. Not Norman, not Anglo-Saxon, but English. The conquest of 1066 didn't just change a king. It rewrote an entire society. It reshaped language, power, and identity. And it tied England to the rest of Europe in a way that would shape its future for centuries. It started with one death, 1 year of chaos, and one battle that changed everything. William had the crown, but he didn't have control. Winning at Hastings was one thing. Holding England was something else entirely, because the country he had just taken wasn't loyal. It was angry, unstable, and ready to fight back. And it did. Almost immediately, rebellions broke out across England. Local lords refused to accept Norman rule. Entire regions pushed back, and every uprising sent the same message. William wasn't secure, so he did what he always did. He crushed them. Hard. The most brutal example came in the north. In 1069, after a major rebellion backed by Danish forces, William made a decision. He wasn't just going to defeat resistance, he was going to erase it. What followed became known as the harrying of the north. Norman forces swept across the region, burning villages, destroying crops, killing livestock, anything that could keep people alive. This wasn't just punishment. It was devastation. Entire areas were left empty. People starved. Communities disappeared. And after that, rebellion stopped being a real threat. Fear had done its job. But fear alone doesn't hold a kingdom together. William needed something more permanent, so he built it. Literally. Castles. Not the giant stone ones you might be picturing, but fast, simple, and incredibly effective. Motte and Bailey castles. A wooden tower on a raised mound, overlooking everything around it. A fenced courtyard. Ditches. Defences. Quick to build. Hard to attack, and impossible to ignore. Within a few years, they were everywhere. Each one a reminder of who was in charge. Each one saying the same thing. This land belongs to the Normans now. Then came the real shift. William didn't just rule England, he replaced it. The old Anglo-Saxon elite? Gone. Stripped of land, stripped of power, and in their place, Norman lords. Men loyal to William, men who owed everything to him. In one generation, thousands of English landowners were replaced by a few hundred Normans. It wasn't gradual, it was total. And that changes how a country works. Because now, power doesn't come from tradition, it comes from the king. To hold it all together, William introduced something that would define medieval Europe: feudalism. At the top, the king. Below him, barons who held land in exchange for loyalty and soldiers. Below them, knights. And at the bottom, everyone else. It was strict, it was structured, and it worked. For the first time, the entire kingdom was tied directly to the crown. Not loosely, directly. And William didn't stop there. In 1086, he ordered something almost unbelievable for the time: a complete survey of his kingdom. Every piece of land, every village, every animal, all recorded. This became the Domesday Book, and it gave William something no king before him had: total visibility. He knew who owned what it was worth, and what he could demand. Taxes, resources, soldiers, nothing slipped through. By this point, England wasn't just conquered. It was rebuilt, stronger, more controlled, more centralized than ever before. But here's where the story gets bigger. Because the Normans didn't just rule England, they ruled Normandy too. And that connection changed everything. For the first time, the English crown was tied directly to land in France. One ruler, two sides of the channel, and that's the foundation of something much bigger than just a kingdom. Because while William was locking down England, other Normans were expanding. In southern Italy, in Sicily, taking land, building power, doing exactly what Normans did best: conquering. It wasn't one clean, unified empire. Not in the modern sense, but it was close. A network of Norman-controlled territories stretching across Europe. England, Normandy, southern Italy, Sicily, all connected by the same roots, the same culture, the same mindset: take what you can and hold it. And it all comes back to 1066. Because conquering England didn't just give William a crown, it gave the Normans something way more important: a base, wealth, power, legitimacy. From there, they didn't just rule. They expanded, they connected kingdoms, they shaped the future of Europe. So when people think about the Norman Conquest, they usually picture one moment, one battle, Hastings, the arrow, the turning point. But the real story is what came after. Because that's when a conquest turns into something bigger. That's when it becomes an empire. So after William the Conqueror, the story doesn't slow down. If anything, it gets bigger. Because now England isn't just a conquered kingdom. It's part of something much larger, a cross-channel power. And the man who really takes this to the next level is Henry II. Now Henry isn't just another king. He's the moment where everything clicks into place. Because instead of just conquering land, he gains it through strategy, through inheritance, and most importantly, through marriage. Henry marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, and this changes everything, because Eleanor isn't just a queen, she's one of the most powerful women in Europe, and she controls Aquitaine, a massive, wealthy region in southern France. When Henry marries her, he doesn't just gain a partner, he gains her lands. Just like that, his power explodes. Now add that to what he already has: England, Normandy, Anjou, and suddenly Henry isn't just a king. He's ruling over a huge stretch of Western Europe. This is what historians call the Angevin Empire. And at its peak, it's enormous, from the north of England all the way down to the south of France. It's not one neat, unified country. It's a collection of lands, all tied together under one ruler. And that's what makes it so powerful, but also so complicated. Because here's the twist. Even though Henry controls all this land in France, technically he's still a vassal to the King of France, which means the King of England is, in theory, subordinate to another king, at least on paper. In reality, not so much, because the French king at this time, the Capetians, are relatively weak. They don't control much land directly, they don't have the same resources. And compared to Henry, they're outmatched, so Henry ends up in this strange position. He's both a king and technically someone else's subject. And that tension is going to cause problems. A lot of problems. Now, another key part of how this empire works is feudalism. Because Henry doesn't personally control every inch of land. Instead, he relies on nobles. Lords who hold land in exchange for loyalty. In many cases, French nobles owe allegiance to him, which means even in areas he doesn't directly govern, he still has influence, indirect control, and that makes his reach even bigger. But holding all of this together isn't easy, because land like this doesn't just stay under control. You have to fight for it, constantly. Henry and his successors are almost always at war, defending their territories, expanding them, putting down rebellions, trying to keep everything from falling apart, because the bigger the empire gets, the harder it is to manage. Still, for a time, it works. England is richer, more powerful, deeply connected to continental Europe, and strategically it's in a perfect position. Control of places like Normandy and Aquitaine isn't just about land. It's about trade, resources, access, movement of armies. These regions are some of the most valuable in medieval Europe, and controlling them gives the English kings a serious advantage. But there's a catch. Actually, there are a few, because all of this power is built on fragile foundations, family ties, feudal loyalty, claims to land. And those things don't stay stable forever. Over time, the French monarchy starts to grow stronger, more organized, more ambitious, and they begin pushing back, trying to reclaim land, trying to break this cross-channel power. And that's when things start to shift, because what was once an advantage becomes a problem. English kings are now deeply tied to French territory, which means they're constantly pulled into conflict on the continent. And eventually, that conflict turns into something much bigger, because English kings don't just want to hold land in France anymore. They start claiming the French crown itself. The most famous example, Edward the Third. He uses inheritance claims to argue that he should be king of France, and that claim leads to one of the longest conflicts in medieval history, the 100 Years' War. So what started with the Normans doesn't just end with England being conquered. It creates a chain reaction, a cross-European power, an empire built through land, marriage, and war, and eventually a rivalry that defines centuries of history. Because once England was tied to France, there was no easy way out, and the consequences of that lasted for generations. So after the Normans built this cross-channel empire, everything starts to unravel. Because holding land in both England and France sounds powerful, but in reality, it's a constant problem, and the cracks start showing pretty quickly. The French kings, the Capetians, begin to grow stronger. Slowly at first, but steadily. And they're not happy about a foreign king controlling huge parts of their country. So they push back, hard. Over time, they start taking land back. One of the biggest turning points comes under King Philip II of France. He targets the English king, John, the son of Henry II. And John is not great. Through a mix of bad leadership and military defeat, he loses Normandy in 1204. Just like that, one of the most important Norman territories is gone. And that changes everything, because now England is no longer fully a cross-channel empire. It's starting to separate, but that loss also creates resentment. English kings don't forget, and they don't give up their claims. Meanwhile, back in England, something else is happening. Power is shifting, not just between countries, but inside the kingdom itself. In 1215, King John is forced to agree to something huge, the Magna Carta. Now, at the time, it's not about democracy. It's about the barons pushing back against the king. But it sets a precedent that even the king has limits, and that idea doesn't go away. Over the next century, England's political system starts to evolve. Parliament begins to take shape. Not powerful yet, but growing. Step by step, the balance of power is changing. At the same time, the conflict with France isn't over, not even close. Because in 1337, everything explodes again, this time on a much bigger scale. The 100 Years' War. It starts when Edward III of England claims the French crown. And this isn't a small war. It's generations of fighting, across multiple kings, multiple phases, and it reshapes both countries. At first, England does surprisingly well. Victories like Crécy and Agincourt show the strength of English armies, especially the longbow. For a while, it even looks like England might actually win. But wars like this don't stay one-sided. France adapts, recovers, and then comes a turning point. Joan of Arc, a young woman who rallies the French and helps turn the tide. After that, momentum shifts. Slowly but surely, the English are pushed back, and by 1453, it's over. England loses almost all its remaining land in France, except for one small port, Calais, The empire is gone. Completely. And that marks the end of something that started all the way back in 1066. But the effects don't stop there, because England doesn't just lose territory. It changes internally too. Almost immediately after the war ends, England falls into its own conflict, the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war between rival factions of the royal family. Lancaster, York, decades of instability, betrayal and shifting power, until finally, in 1485, Henry Tudor takes the throne. Henry VII, and with him, something new begins. The medieval period is ending. The early modern world is starting, and if you zoom all the way out, you can see the full arc. It starts with the Normans, a group of former Vikings who take England in a single year of chaos. They build a powerful cross-European network. They tie England to France. They create an empire, and that connection drives centuries of conflict. Wars over land, wars over crowns, wars over identity, until, eventually, it all breaks apart. England turns inward, France consolidates, and Europe moves into a new era. But none of it happens in isolation, because it all traces back to 1066. One invasion, one battle, and a chain reaction that shaped the next 400 years of history.